everyone. Good morning. Thank you for coming out on this rainy Thursday morning. Thank you for being with us here at E-Werk in Weimar and for your interest in the topic of trust in media. My name is Benjamin Bergner. I work in New York City for a non-for-profit organization called 1014 Space for Ideas that's initiated by the Goethe-Institut and the German Foreign Ministry. And it is my great pleasure to welcome you this morning and to host this fantastic panel called Fact or Fiction, Why We Trust or Why We Don't Trust the Media. We have about 60 minutes to dive into this, and I would like to let you know that there's also space at the end for your questions. So if you do have a question, please keep it in mind and we will bring you a microphone towards the end of this session. Now let's start into this day, the second day of the Kultursymposium Weimar, with trust in media and journalism. And the question, is it waning? Because in order to form our opinions accurately as citizens, as professionals, we do need accurate information. And usually, unless we know someone who has actually seen something themselves, we will need journalists and media professionals that are trustworthy and that can report on news, on something that happened. We do have to trust that they work well, that they are critical, that they fact check, and that they also protect their sources. Since the rise of social media, things have changed a little bit because everybody, every citizen, every one of us can be a creator and can potentially reach a very wide audience, much bigger than it used to be. This way, through social media, social movements, political movements have been organized. Information was shared immediately, and also large traditional media organizations do rely on sources from social media when they don't have a correspondent or a person or a contact immediately on the ground when something happens. However, trust in news organizations and in journalists has also been eroding for some parts of society at least, or for some journalists and some media brands at least. Some politicians have called them fake news, or some, like Angela Merkel, called our times post-factual, kind of implying that opinions nowadays matter more than actual facts and the truth. Today we want to hear from 4 experts, entrepreneurs and activists who are working hard to help counter fake news and help navigate the sphere of fact and fiction, the sphere between truth and fake. And I want to introduce our panel. You see 3 of us, or 3 speakers on stage here, and a 4th one is tuned in digitally, and I'm hoping that she hears us and that she's with us. Let me start on stage right with Samarth Bansal. He's an independent journalist, writer and computer programmer. He's based in India. Samarth graduated from the Indian Institute of Technology, Kanpur, in 2015, and he has worked at a tech startup before becoming a reporter for The Hindu and the Hindustan Times. In 2018, he was a reporting fellow with the Wall Street Journal's investigative team in New York City for about 5 months, and he started working independently in 2019. His work has appeared in various publications, among them The Atlantic and the HuffPost. Then to Samarth's right, Dina Aboughazala. She's an Egyptian media entrepreneur and journalist. She holds a master's degree in interactive journalism from the City University of New York. She has worked for the BBC for over 14 years before launching her own startup called eGap, which enables journalists from the Middle East and Africa to publish stories that challenge dominant or common narratives that are a bit more critical than other stories maybe, and that helps them share them among their communities and regional and international media. We want to hear more about that later. Then on my left is Sam Gregory. He's a human rights activist and expert for misinformation. He's based in New York, and he's the executive director of Witness, a global network which helps people use video and technology to defend human rights. He's an expert on new forms of dis- or misinformation, such as deepfakes, and how to counter and just recognize these deepfakes. Welcome to this panel, and then Here we have Angelina Kariakina tuned in from Kiev in Ukraine. Thank you for being with us this morning, Angelina. She's a journalist and editor. Angelina has worked for Euronews Kiev, Hromadske TV as an editor-in-chief for 3 years, and at Suspline, the Ukrainian public broadcaster, as the head of news. She has covered Ukrainian political and social affairs, the Maidan protests, and the Russian war against Ukraine. In March 2020, she co-founded the Public Interest Journalism Lab, an interdisciplinary initiative that seeks to popularize best practices in public interest journalism in the digital age. And she is the author and editor of the lab's Reckoning project, Evidence and Testimony from Ukraine, which documents Russian war crimes in Ukraine. Thank you all for being with us today. And yes, we will start with each of you, and I want to start with Samarth with the first question. You're a freelance journalist. Can you tell us a little bit about trust means for your work? What does it actually help, or how does distrust influence your everyday practice as a journalist?
Yeah, thank you. I'm glad to be here. So I started my career reporting for the legacy media, worked in with English language Indian newspapers for 3 years before becoming a freelancer. So one of the things that I realized based on my own experience plus reading about the larger political environment in which the media exists is that initially, back in the day, newspapers originated in a time of scarcity. Information was scarce, and that's where a few media organizations derived authority, that we are going to tell you these are the facts. That's not the age we live in today. There are multiple sources, and as the sources of information increase, the value or authority of a particular source starts going down. So I think this old model, where there was hierarchy in terms of who can tell you what's the truth and what's not the truth, that is broken today, right? Lot of trust that used to be held in institutions is now moving more to individuals, to the network. So I think that while we are seeing fractures in the way a lot of our readers trust, quote unquote, the media, though I don't like the term the media because there's such a wide spectrum when we talk about the media, but still you see that some shift is happening between the old model. It's just that we don't know what the new model is. So I see myself at this point at a time where a lot of experiments are happening, and I am a participant in one of those experiments. So I do my own newsletters, I write for different publications, I'm trying to find my own voice in the way I interact with readers, rather than simply following the standard rules that have been established that this is how you tell a story, or this is what constitutes a story, this is not a story. So I think in that spectrum is where I find myself fitting in, but trust is something that I think everything from what I decide to report on, what I work on, it's at the center stone of it, because it takes so much time to build trust. But I think once you build it, it's very hard to replicate. So it's almost like a currency. So that as an independent writer, as a freelancer, I think about this stuff, but it's all experiment is how I think about it at the moment.
Do you get feedback from your readers about that, gives you an idea of somebody trusts me really well here with something, or there's distrust and I get some critical feedback?
Yeah, I think, it depends a lot on what the story you're telling, what kind of sourcing you have done. So for example, it's again, the reader feedback is it's so spread across. I remember a couple of years ago, I did an investigation, when the Indian government was procuring ventilators during the pandemic. So we found out one startup which got a really big order from the Indian government, from the Prime Minister's fund. My reporting had shown that, the machines were faulty. They had fabricated, the numbers that were coming up on the device. They didn't really have what they were promising, but they were saying, oh, we are selling the cheapest ventilator that's available in the market. Now, when you do a story like this, you need people inside the company to tell you, how were decisions made, what actually happens inside the machine. Now, these people you cannot name because they are, risking by telling you the story. So if it's something where I can't exactly tell you, who I spoke to, why do I trust this person, right? Why should my reader trust me when I am saying I trust this person, you know? So all sorts of questions come into play. So there, a lot of it is about my integrity, my past work, or the publication I'm writing this for. So that's like one end of a story where some kind of questions do come up. But say there's something else that I'm doing where the chain of sourcing of, let's say if I followed 5 steps to reach a particular conclusion. And if I'm transparent enough to tell you that, this is the process I followed, this is what I know, this is what I don't know. If I'm clear about, the whole spectrum of things, and in the writing itself, right, I'm a little more humble rather than going out and say that, I am going to tell you how things are. I think that way I have seen in the reception that readers actually like that more rather than, that trust me bro kind of thing that, just because I'm a journalist, a professionally trained journalist, trust me. So I think I see the spectrum of things in which the kind of story you are telling. And reader feedback, I think transparency is something that I have seen whenever I'm more transparent. Let's say there is some conflict of interest and I'm declaring it upfront rather than, putting a star mark and, leaving it at the end. It helps because it's almost like I say that I think we should do journalism like I'm telling a story to my friend at a coffee shop, right? That's the way I also want to write. And whenever that happens, I see much more positive feedback, though that kind of writing is not something, it's not, you don't expect that kind of writing in a newspaper. But I think the more I do it, the more feedback I get that, it sounds more relatable, more humble. So this is the kind of feedback I've got.
It's interesting, you actually rely on the trust of your sources, but you also can't rely on the trust of your readers that, you have those sources, that they are correct, that you did your work well.
Yeah, so, I mean, in our profession, right, the entire chain is built on relationship of trust, right from like the editor trusting the reporter trusting the source, even like the editor trusting the publisher, right? Like, the publisher trusting the editor. Yeah. Like at any point when trust starts breaking, right? This like the work that we do starts breaking apart, which is why even for me, like it's not that someone just comes up and tells me, hey, this is happening in my company or this is what happens in the government. And it sounds like, amazing, sensationalistic. So I'll say, I'm going to do that story. I have to do like 10 checks in my head before I trust someone, right? Like my process is that in my first interview, I would like absorb everything, like, like you tell me everything like for 2 hours. But then, I go back to my notes, I'll ask for documentation, I'll ask for like more proof from my source. It's always, you have to push a lot with your sources because they also at some point get offended. Why are you not trusting me? I am taking this risk. But then as a journalist, I have a responsibility to my readers. So all the kind of tests that, you trust like anyone, right? Like your friend, your partner, anyone. All the protocol that you follow before you trust someone, you have to follow that process with your source. And I think sooner or later, if your story is, if it's flawed, if you got a wrong source, if you got played by the source, it comes up, right? Like maybe not today, maybe a few months from now, a year later. So all I'm trying to say is that if I trust a source, it's not just like I took someone's word for it because I felt they were right. We follow a process before we trust the source. And I think that is something we like try to explain to the readers to our best possible ability. But it's also on the reader then to say, okay, they have done the job to the best of what they can do, so let's trust us. So something in that zone is where we play.
Of course, yeah, it's an interesting triangle of trust. Dina, you launched eGap, and it's described as a virtual newsroom that enables journalists to challenge stereotypes and common narratives. How does this work? How does your work actually happen on an everyday basis?
So our starting point was that the importance of representation. Because for us, we see trust is very strongly linked to that. Because when you have underrepresentation of a certain community, this leads to misrepresentation, and then this leads to the audience not trusting the way you cover them because they don't feel that they're accurately and fairly represented. But the problem is that there is a huge gap between the thousands of journalists who graduate every year, who are on the ground in, let's say, the southern hemisphere. Like my starting point is the Middle East and Africa, because this is where I come from. So I'm from Egypt. We belong to both regions. In Egypt alone, there are 4,000 graduates every year from public journalism schools of public universities alone. This doesn't count private universities or others who join journalism from other, studying fields. And all of these talents are looking for jobs. And at the same time, the problem is that we have a huge gap in the quality of education. So unfortunately, at least I can say this with higher certainty about my country, Egypt, but this applies to other countries as well. If you go to public schools, you don't get that high quality education. So that means that you graduate missing many of the needed skills to be able to do a good job as a journalist. And the problem is that also most of the local newsrooms have fallen in this vicious circle of low quality journalism. So when you graduate and join any of these local newsrooms, you're actually picking bad habits. And then you're stuck in this vicious circle. And what we're seeing is that we've been seeing a lot of brain drain, where many of the talented journalists who believe this is not the right journalism are just leaving the industry altogether and going more into marketing or wider communication jobs. And at the same time, you have the international media, or in general, the news industry. It needs to, we have this 24/7 news cycle, right? You're always looking for stories, but what's happening is that most of the news outlets are repeating the same stories. They are copying the same stories from each other, relying on social media, as you said, and the problem with that is that, for example, in a country like Egypt, again, the main language is Arabic, right? So when you go on Twitter, first, not all Egyptians are on Twitter, and then when you go and look at the people who tweet in English, you're only getting like a sort of 1% or 2% of the population. So when you start building your story based on the views of the tweets, okay, you're already misrepresenting a whole country. And this doesn't happen on the level of a country, it happens on the level of a whole continent, if we're speaking of Africa, or a whole region and the Middle East, and this is very dangerous. Then you fall into the stereotype. And this is where a gap comes in, where like, okay, there's all these journalists who are on the ground, who our starting point is that they are the best to tell their stories, they know their communities best, they understand the culture, they're living there, they can give you more nuanced, more higher, how do you say it, a story that respects the complexity rather than a very oversimplified story. And at the same time, we'll be giving international media and regional media new stories, right, rather than copying from each other. But the problem is that these group of people need a lot of training, okay, to be able to produce the quality of journalism that the international media are looking for. And international media doesn't have the time or effort to spend on training all this. The problem, because also to really master a skill, you need more than one training or workshop and off you go. You really need day in, day out of repetitive, reiterated feedback and repetition of the work, practice by doing. So this is where a gap comes in, or online platform, exactly, it serves like as if it's a virtual newsroom where anyone can sign up and they start pitching us their stories, the stories that they are seeing on the ground. So for example, one of the top questions we receive from our journalists is like, what is the international media interested in? Tell us so that we can feed you the same story. And we tell them, no, you tell us what's going on in your country, because we want to change this, right? Like even me sitting in Cairo, I don't know what's going on in Botswana, right? You need to tell me what's going on. So we're against also this whole premise that an editor sitting in London or Berlin or New York or wherever have already decided this is the story that I want to run from Egypt or whatever. Okay, of course there might be a big story, but there are other stories happening as well. And if you're looking to cover the whole story, because there is space for the whole story, like with the digital, as I said, the many millions of stories that are online, there is space to cover the whole story instead of just keeping repeating a single story. So they start pitching us their stories. We don't accept all stories, but the difference is that we filter based on the story itself, and when we don't accept the story, we tell them why, because we want them to develop, so we give them feedback, because this is how you truly develop. And then when I accept a story, we think, oh, this is an interesting story, we work with the journalist on formulating it in the best format to increase the chances of getting commissioned, and then we start circulating it to media outlets that we think would be interested in it. And once it gets commissioned, the journalist starts producing it again with our guidance and mentoring of IGAP's team, and then we do a review to ensure we fact check, it's credible, it's high quality, and then it's published under the journalist's name with a reference to IGAP at the end. So the end result, the journalists is developing their skills, they're learning by doing, they are enhancing their career prospects by building their CV with bylines in top media outlets, and at the same time they're getting paid much better than what they get paid locally. And our ambition is that in the long term, medium term to the long term, what would this lead to is to create a new generation of high quality local journalists who can then use this knowledge that they gained through their work with us and to start their own local media ventures. And hopefully when we reach this level of critical mass, we can truly elevate the quality of local journalism.
Thank you. I want to continue with Sam. At Witness, you help citizen journalists globally to expose injustices in several fields, in human rights violations, also environment, sustainability. What help do you provide? And you work specifically with video. I'd be interested in sort of when it's about human rights violations, I'm sure it's both like dangerous but also like ethically tricky, thinking about videos that we've seen recently in the media of police violence, for example. How does Witness work? What services do you provide to your citizen journalists?
Thank you. Yes, so we are all familiar with the types of accounts that we see on social media that come from citizen journalists, from human rights activists, and there are millions of people globally, sometimes who do this on a year-by-year basis, sometimes who are thrust into the middle of it. Think of an ordinary person in Myanmar during the coup last year, individuals in a country like Ukraine that are facing war. So there's a huge range of people who are faced with this dilemma of often taking out their cell phone and trying to share a trustworthy or truthful account of what is happening, which could be literal documentation, this happened, or it might be, I want to explain what's happening, right? So people do both. And it's Witness's role to really stand alongside them. We're not an outlet, we don't distribute media. What we do is we work on multiple layers to make it easier for people to film and share in ways that are safe and ethical and trustworthy. So that could be something like you're filming police violence or a war crime. How do you film in a way that makes it harder to challenge it as evidence, right? So how do you show the context? How do you prove it hasn't been manipulated by filming continuously? How do you perhaps use technical means to do that? And then how do you make decisions about sharing it? Because when you share, for example, a piece of police violence in the country where I'm based, and Witness works globally, but I'm based in the US, you know that if you share it first, instantly the police account undercuts it, right? They pick all the holes in the piece of video of the police violence, and they have the advantage of being able to say, don't believe that bit, don't believe that bit, while of course if the police account comes out first, the citizen video is often able to show the failings in it. So we really think about that whole range of questions. And when it comes to trust, of course, trust is fundamental, and most human rights activists and citizen journalists, and particularly human rights activists, rely on trust, right? You know, you're always being attacked if you're a human rights organization, and if you're a citizen journalist, it's going to be attacked. You know, you didn't film everything, you didn't cover what it is. So trust is fundamental, but it's very fragile for the individuals we work with. And the other dimension of Witness's work, and we work with millions of people who are literally doing the documenting, is we know that there are many things that are out of their control. And so one of the areas we work on, and it's been very visible in the last 6 months, is around the ways people undercut the credibility of citizen accounts. And one way that's happening more and more, and I was in a workshop just last week in Nairobi with about 30 journalists and fact checkers and activists from across Africa, and we were talking about the impact of AI and AI-generated media. And of course, most people are not facing deep fakes every day. What they are seeing more and more is people saying, no, anything can be falsified, it's a deep fake, you can't believe anything in the environment. And of course, what that means is when we have this climate of you can't trust anything, the accounts you trust least, or we are told to trust least, are the voices we should probably listen to most. So the voices of people who are exposing injustice or human rights abuses. So we're in a kind of vicious cycle that's happening that is also reinforced by technical trends like AI, and of course big societal trends like fake news claims and law and legislation that particularly targets people who are trying to speak out against the state.
Just briefly, you also help counter disinformation. You know, you already mentioned deep fakes. What do we see there at the moment? What are the biggest threats? Just briefly.
Yeah, and my colleagues around the world work on this area because we've seen, of course, that accounts get dismissed very quickly. There are obviously technical questions around mis and disinformation. I would say a couple of the things that came through very strongly in the discussion, actually just last week in Nairobi, because we were talking about this, is a lot of the time our discussion on these issues is all about there's a foreign actor trying to influence us, right? And we know how that plays out. Most of the participants in that workshop were saying it is our own governments targeting at us, it is corporate interests trying to share misleading information and undermine us, and they were also looking to really local responses. And I think this is one of the challenges is, most rumors, most malicious claims never reach the level of, say, a national level fact checker. They're at a community level. They spread rapidly on a messaging group. They spread rapidly as a piece of video or photo that's been discontextualized that claims to show one thing or another. So when we think about solutions here, the way we look at it is often very grounded contemporary media literacy. How do you think about it in a WhatsApp group? How to work out whether something's true or false? And also trying to go local and make sure that the platforms are providing tools that work at a local level. So for example, how do you quickly check whether an image or a video that you see in a WhatsApp group is actually what it says it is, rather than a video that's recycled from a year ago in a different place? So we have to think locally, and we have to think about this context of who is actually the perpetrators here. And it's often our own governments, it's corporate interest as much as foreign governments.
Thank you. Angelina, I hope you can hear us well and you were able to follow the discussion a little bit. Thank you so much for joining us today from Kiev. I hope that that you and your family are well, considering the circumstances. You've been working as a journalist in Kiev and Ukraine for many, many years, having been the head of news of the public broadcaster. What is your work currently? How do you provide news in times of war?
Yes, hi. Thank you for having me. I think I'd start with a note that we here in Ukraine we're living in a sort of ultimate reality. So everything matters and everything is real. Action is real. Solidarity is real. All things and words which may sound, conceptual or pathetic, they are real because there is a real something behind them, behind these notions. And in Ukraine, information really costs life, so it's vital. It's very easy to see, whether you are serving to the needs of the audience or whether you are not, because you can just go out and see the reality. So the war is an ultimate reality, and for the journalist, it's working in the circumstances of ultimate reality. Ukrainian case, of course, is different from other countries in terms of trust towards media. Media is an institution and is a part of number of social institutions. In Ukraine, for the past year, a year and a half of this horrific war, the general trust towards institutions that include the government, the church, the armed forces, the law enforcement, you name it, all the possible institutions, it grew significantly, and it grew for a reason, for a good reason, because Ukrainian institutions are fighting the war, and it is very easy for the people of Ukraine to see whether they are working or whether they're not working, whether they are really in place, I mean literally, whether you have your local government, whether you have your local law enforcement in place when the invader comes. So it's very easy, it's quite easy to understand why this trust grew. So the media is also among this institution. And the numbers are quite telling. So for the past year, it's the polls that I'm telling you about. It's the Kiev International Institute of Sociology. The trust towards Ukrainian media grew from 37% to 32% to 57%. So it's quite significant right now, for a good reason, which I already told you. I will give you just a small example of a public broadcaster working in Kharkiv. It's one of the biggest cities, probably the second biggest city in Ukraine, in the east. So when the full-scale Russian invasion started, there was a trouble with air alarm, air sirens in the city. They were either broken or they were broken, on purpose by someone. So people couldn't hear the sirens when the rockets were flying. So the public broadcaster, they had this quite popular Telegram channel. In Ukraine, Telegram channels are probably now #1 source of information, and that's another topic of discussion. Maybe I'll get back to that later. So the public broadcaster in Kharkiv started announcing the air sirens on their Telegram channel, and the number of their subscribers skyrocketed because people really needed that information. It's not, opinion. It's not, interesting story or something like that. It's a vital information that you just need to know, whether you can come out from your house, come out from your building, and not, get under the rocket or meet a Russian soldier. So this is how it works. It's a simple, small example, but basically for Ukrainian media, it works like that. You need to be on the ground, you need to be there, and you need to provide vital information which really serves the needs of your audience. This is how the needs of Ukrainian audience look now, right now. Of course, if we go back to the previous year, the COVID times, the huge fail with the vaccination campaign, it's a different topic. But right now, with the full-scale invasion, with the war, it's quite different. Let me quickly get to the things that we also do at the Public Interest Journalism Lab, how we work with our research and what we found out. I think it's an interesting finding which relates to many societies and to many communities. So we were looking for the stories which are interesting and relevant for different parts of Ukrainian society. And we were wondering which stories have the most trust among Ukrainians. We were working with the concept of trust generally. And we could see that it is hard to disrupt communities with the strongest ties. So when you have a village or a small community which really shares common action, they do something together. Whether it's, building a church together or building a school together or, working on a small case of, raising money for a pet house or something like that. These small actions, sometimes they're not small, they grew into these communities and they create ties which are really, really hard to disrupt, because it's really hard to come into this community and tell them that, for example, your mayor is a liar, or your mayor is a good person and you know that he's a liar, when you do really know your mayor, because you made something, because you were in interaction with with your community, with your local government, when you really do something together. So in Ukraine, this concept of doing something together, especially during the war, it's sort of an example why it is hard to disrupt this trust. I will give you a small explanation how it worked with the Russians coming into Ukrainian villages. The Russian soldiers really misunderstood the concept or the role of the local head of the village. They thought that it's the same way, that it works the same way as in Russia, where there is a very strict vertical government, when a local head is under the oblast head, and the oblast, the regional head, under the central government. In this vertical line. In Ukraine, the local head of the village is someone whom the village has elected. So people know this person, they trust this person for a reason. And when the Russian soldiers tried to ask why the local mayors or the local heads are not leaving their villages, why are they staying with the villages, they just could not understand how this really, how this democracy works on a local level. People do something together, they trust each other, and it is hard for someone from the outside to come and to disrupt this sort of basically relationship. Maybe you have questions on this level, because I have too many things to share.
I have a lot of questions.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. I hope we can talk about a few of these questions later. Time is running, and I do want to show a video, kind of like the one that you saw yesterday at the opening event at Weimar Halle. We have asked the same group of people about how they consume media, what they trust, and how they distinguish between facts and fiction. Let's please have a look.
Als Berliner informiere ich mich klassisch bei der RBB-Abendschau, schon seit so lange wie ich denken kann eigentlich, und bei der Tagesschau. In der Printzeitung, im Radio, im Fernsehen, im Internet.
I try to get multiple point of views from media. I don't believe in one outlet or one source. I think history should be learned like that. I think media should be looked at like that.
There are some newspapers that I know that I don't trust in terms of that I don't agree ideologically, but I think there is something there that also helps me to understand the context or the situation.
Zum Beispiel in Facebook, Instagram, YouTube channels of Radio Freedom and BBC, but also some investigation journalist channels like Goethe-Institut.
Ich lese estnische und deutsche öffentlich-rechtliche Medien, auch der Economist, also auch manchmal soziale Medien. Generell vertraue ich den öffentlichen Medien bzw. den öffentlich-rechtlichen Medien. Ich habe das Gefühl, dass sie meistens recht neutral zu einigen Dingen berichten.
Ich würde sagen, ich vertraue den Medien zu 80%, weil Medien in der Vergangenheit schon sich eigentlich als oft sehr vertrauenswürdig erwiesen haben, indem sie ihre Quellen auch offengelegt haben.
Also den Medien würde ich nicht vertrauen im klassischen Sinne, wie ich meiner Frau vertraue oder meinen Eltern. Ich hinterfrage kritisch Sachen, die ich vielleicht einen anderen Blickpunkt sehe, und versuche mich dann, was heute ja möglich ist, gleichmäßig zu informieren.
Es gibt manchmal Social Propaganda in Taiwan, deswegen denke ich, ich sollte mehrere Zeitungen oder Social Media lesen und danach mich entscheiden. I have some stories of my friends and colleagues who can talk with their parents. They stayed in occupied territories since 2014. There are lots of scary stories when parents don't believe their children, that they are attacked by Russians.
Diese Fake News, die sich recht schnell und effektiv in den Social Media verbreiten, ja, erschüttern auf jeden Fall unser Vertrauen in die Medien, weil man dann sich nicht mehr sicher ist, wem man vertrauen kann und wem man nicht vertrauen kann. Naja, erstmal muss überhaupt der Mensch verstehen, dass es um Fake News geht. Wenn der Mensch es gar nicht versteht, dann vielleicht ändert es dann nichts an Vertrauen.
I think some people are doing their own research and instead of trusting journalists, they don't like what they see sometimes, so they just try to find information that suits better what they think about some situation.
Einige Menschen fühlen sich einfach vernachlässigt von dem Staat, von den JournalistInnen, von den Mainstream-Medien.
Würde ich Fake News erkennen? Das ist eine sehr schwierige Frage und ich glaube in Teilen ja und in Teilen nein.
No, I don't trust my own judgment.
Also ich kann definitiv nicht im Social Media Fake News erkennen. Das ist ein Ding der Unmöglichkeit.
Also ich glaube, wenn ich ehrlich bin, kann ich es nicht genau erkennen. Ich denke aber, dass ich schon gewisse Instrumente habe, um nachzuprüfen, ob das jetzt Wahrheitsgehalt hat oder nicht.
Let's be honest, I don't have much time to check every news.
I trust my own judgment in recognizing fake news. Whenever I see something clumsy, I think about it and I just do more research.
Dieses gesunde Misstrauen, nenne ich es mal, wenn ich jetzt mal auf eine alte Brücke laufe, gucke ich auch erst mit dem Fuß, ob die Brücke auch hält. So ähnlich mache ich es dann auch bei Social Media Informationen und dann irgendwann schließt sich der Kreis und sagt, ja, richtiges Ergebnis, falsches Ergebnis.
When listening to them and when also thinking about sort of a new generation that grows up in a world where there aren't the big media brands that are trustworthy, or they aren't the only ones, there's also deep fakes and all of that. I wonder sometimes, maybe the kids are all right, maybe people do get more critical and do learn to what sources to trust and what not to trust. I'd like to hear from the four of you just briefly, where are you getting your news and what can you recommend in terms of critical fact-checking? Are you critical towards your sources? Let's do a quick round, Samarth.
So I don't watch TV at all. Zero. TV is toxic. In general, it is. They're just shouting people. So also in general, I personally prefer reading because I think visual medium does not allow for that much time for reflection. But when I'm reading carefully, I can think. So I'm skeptical about everything. I think skepticism is like a journalistic skill. You can't be a good journalist if you're not skeptical. So I apply that even if I'm reading a story written by a friend of mine. So that's standard. Number two, I also follow, of course, the newspapers. To lot of good independent writing in newsletters, YouTube channels, etc. So if I find someone whose past work I've seen is good enough, I follow that. But third, and I think that's the most important from my POV, is that I have significantly reduced my news consumption. So I'm not saying I don't consume, it's not zero, but it's less, so that I consume less information, but I think about it more. So, if the purpose of news is to make me a better citizen, so that I have a better mental model of how the world works, then I think absorbing less information, thinking about it more, makes me better rather than, scrolling through Twitter and, reading a lot of links and not knowing what to do about it after an hour. Mm-hmm. So rather than, take one story and spend time over it. So that's kind of how my news consumption looks like. Written word, people I trust, and more depth rather than breadth.
Yeah, let's jump to Angelina. You mentioned how vital it is in Ukraine in this current situation with getting the right information at the right time. Where do you get your news? What channels are you using? Who do you trust?
For me, as a citizen, and for me, as a journalist and editor who runs things, it's vital to have people on the ground. So at the beginning of the full-scale invasion, the majority of the newsrooms were relocated elsewhere. I don't know, Warsaw, Riga, Vilnius, you name it. And they were writing news about Ukraine being outside Ukraine. They also did a great job, but for us, for the public broadcaster, it was vital that we have people in places. So it's not only the national level where you have people sitting in Kiev, but it also local level, sitting in the regional centers, and hyper-local level, when you have people in smaller villages telling you stories, feeding you news. That's sort of became vital because the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, it went through a number of regions, and you literally had to navigate through you know, through Ukraine is a big country, through the whole northern border and then eastern border and then also the south. And you needed to make sure that you have news from the ground, that people who are reporting, you know, that the Russian tanks are coming, they really saw these Russian tanks. They can confirm that things that are happening are really happening. But also, I need to quickly make this point. Apart from a very simple fact that journalists need to come out from their offices and be there, be on the ground. In case of Ukraine and global coverage of Ukraine, it is also, you know, you need to be here to report whether it's a war. You know, apart from the war, Ukraine is a functioning democracy. You know, businesses are running, children are going to schools and kindergartens. Things are still happening in Ukraine. The government is working, you know, people are living, children are being delivered. So there are lots of stories, interesting stories in Ukraine, and it's a functioning country. You need to be here in order to cover it. There is a very long post-colonial, post-imperial tradition. There was, now the war has broken it, to cover Ukraine sitting in Moscow, in the central office of Moscow, and cover the whole post-Soviet region. So it's vital to be here in the place. It's also important to check the facts. We are working with the authorities and local authorities, and in Ukraine, it's also, you know, quite specific work because we're functioning under the martial law, and there are certain restrictions. I would call them, you know, it's a sort of military censorship. You know, you cannot report on certain things as they happen. You cannot live stream a shelling. You cannot share videos of, you know, Ukrainian military equipment being moved around the country and things like that. And these restrictions are understandable. I mean, they are logical to us. But what I wanted to point out is that Ukrainian case of covering war in Ukraine, a global case, is that even in a country that is at war, that is defending itself, it is still possible to provide professional and inclusive coverage with tens of thousands of journalists working in this country at this place. So even with the military censorship, even with the number of restrictions, it is still possible to make sure that the country is covered, and then that the battlefield and that the civilian life under this shelling is covered. The only important thing is that you are here. You can really you are responsible for what you are saying because you are here, you are witnessing it, especially when it comes to the war crimes. I mean, you're really talking to real people. You see their houses, you see their bodies with you know, with the traces of torture. You are here. You need to be here. You represent your audience. That is vital. I think our audience also feels underrepresented in many ways. We need also to make sure, this is what our lab research is also saying, we need to make sure that our audience is also part of our editorial decisions. So there could be lots of practices that we can use in order to make sure that the audience feels that they are part of the story, not only, you know, as them being protagonists of the story, but also deciding what kind of story we are telling today. It could be, you know, participating in our editorial meetings. It could be polls. It could be lots of editorial practices just to make sure that people feel that they are empowered with a journalism.
Thank you. Dina, you made a similar point yesterday, first about representation and then also about the importance of being on the ground and having the stories there. What's your take?
What's my take as in what I follow for news, or we moved on from that question?
No. Well, where are you getting your news, but also like where should one get their news from? Probably from people on the ground is your answer.
definitely. I mean, but this is the problem, right? Because you can't afford to have, as an audience, okay? You don't know whom to follow for every country. So I would know whom to follow for my own country, right? And this is the problem. That's why it's the onus is on the international media, the big media brands like Deutsche Welle, BBC, CNN, etc. So that to make sure that they are bringing us trustworthy news by employing or by even contracting reporters who are on the ground, who can tell us the full story. So, for example, in general, international news, I follow the BBC and New York Times. This is my daily news diet. But when it comes to my own country, and that's why we're actually having this conversation, because when I see stories about Egypt and them, I'm like, no, this is not quite accurate. And that's what I started to realize, okay, maybe all the news about the other countries are not as accurate as well. So this is becoming a little bit, problematic for me. So when it comes to news about my country, I sometimes go to the source itself. So if I want, especially for example during the pandemic, if I want, I would go to the health ministry spokesman Facebook page, etc., and so forth. But one thing that also started that I'm following certain individuals for topics, like topic experts. So if I want to learn about media, I follow certain people, I read what they put out on LinkedIn, on Twitter, and same for tech and the other industries. But I agree. I think the way traditionally or in the past news were made, as I said, as my colleague in Ukraine mentioned, sitting in another capital, this is no longer sustainable and shouldn't be accepted anymore. We have enough people on the ground who can report the story, and I think the more we speak up against the parachute journalism or journalism from afar is a problem. Like what's going on in Sudan right now, many of the big broadcasters actually evacuated their correspondents from Sudan, and they're reporting Sudan from Cairo. Which is, no, you can't do this really. While we still have Sudanese journalists on the ground who can actually tell us the story.
Absolutely. Sam, when it comes to human rights abuses, who do you follow, who do you trust? What mediums or what people?
Yeah, I think I'm going to echo some of the colleagues on the panel. I think there is a role for big institutions, provided they do it equitably, right? So if we look at big media, big human rights organizations, I trust long-standing community-based groups. I understand they have a point of view, and I think understanding that people have a point of view and when they're transparent about this, and something that we were talking about before the panel, like transparency, and Samarth raised it, so I trust long-standing community-based groups. I trust people who have deep expertise, which is grounded in their own context for sharing about something. I want to just talk to the "are the kids all right?" question you raised, which is, I think there's a danger, and I heard it in the quotes in the video, of kind of like doing your homework, doing your own research. I believe the kids are all right, but I think there's also a dangerous tendency where we sort of say, well, just keep trying to evaluate multiple sources, keep trying to work out if you can find the truth, and in my case, the truth in an image. I see a lot of people trying to approach, for example, images and videos with kind of a forensic mindset. They're like, is the pixel in the right place? And that's missing the wood for the trees. It's looking at the wrong place. You should be thinking about who shared this information, have they been trustworthy in the past? Because, for example, in the context of AI-generated information, I can create a perfectly beautiful looking image of something that never happened, and it's not going to be helpful to be trying to go, does it look wrong? Can I work this out? It's not helpful to sort of cultivate that mindset. So we have to be really careful what we think about the mindset is of this sort of do your own research. Yes, be critical of sources. Yes, ask questions, but think about where we might be leading people down paths that actually will be deeply unproductive. We want to actually have people be able to trust the credibility of literal images and videos, but also of stories that come from contexts they're not familiar with, right? And that where we want to cultivate an understanding of how to work out whether to trust that isn't very superficial.
And even having once seen something, it's hard to unsee, even knowing that it's been faked. Yes. Is a fantastic conversation, and I wish we could speak for another hour. I do want to open it for the audience.
Okay, I just want to make a quick point, which is like not to disagree with Dina or Angelina, but I just quickly, I think this, as much as it's very important for reporters to be on ground, I think we sometimes over-index it because you can do a lot of good journalism by like say reading company documents or just helping people make sense of what is going on, even if you're not on the ground. So, if you break down the functions of journalism, one of this, of course, bear witness, be on the ground. But I think the sense-making part of journalism, giving context, explaining things, that's very valuable, which you can do like by just like deep thinking and consuming like 10 sources and telling a story. Just putting it out there that, you know, like ground reporting is important, but sometimes, you know, sense making has also a lot of value.
Yeah. Just to add that the way news is made is that there you have a reporter and you have an editor. So I think this works when because the reporter will tell you what's going on the ground, and then the editor is sitting and you have this conversation. It becomes, I think, problematic when only the person is just sitting in London and covering Cairo.
I do want to give our audience a chance to ask questions, and since we are already very late, I would suggest we're taking, I see one up there, 2, 3. Let's take these 3 questions over there, and if you can, please be brief, and we will take them all at once and then answer them. Thank you. I think.
But I speak very loud.
Yes, and I'm going to repeat your question.
You're good.
Hello, I'm Antonella. I'm a journalist from Chile, and I was wondering about a point of view. As a citizen, each one of us has a political sympathy, and that's why we do journalism. No? So, how do you deal with your own sympathies and with your own prejudice about topics?
Thank you. Let's take the other 2 right away, please. Oh, yeah, if you could just speak loudly, or let's bring you, yeah.
So, hi, I'm a writer from Bangladesh, and I just wanted to know how do you really approach the ideological and doctrinal aspect of news making, especially in a world where, you know, we know the news media outlets, I mean, big or small, they all operate within a media industrial complex. How do you approach that ideological aspect when people are always thinking what to consume, what not, if they really correspond to their views or not, and relying on the news sources which can probably use for information?
Okay, thank you. And we had a 3rd question up there. I'm sorry, I see that there are others. I hope we can continue the conversation later.
Hi, good morning. Thank you very much for the conversation. Mine is more of a comment. What role does the role of the eyewitness in credibility? You know, we spoke about your sources, but following what happened in Sudan, a lot of information we're receiving was eyewitness accounts of people who were stuck in their houses who couldn't leave for days. You know, how key does eyewitness reporting play in trying to counter fake news?
Thank you so much. So we've got the 3 questions about dealing with bias, about the media industrial complex and what sort of media brands to trust, can they even be trusted, and the role of the eyewitness. Who wants to take which?
I can take the first question, because this is something that I personally did, because in the wake of the 2013 protests in Egypt, this is our moment where the country was very polarized, and each one of us in the office, I was still working for the BBC at the time, each one of us in the office had their own, you know, opinion of whether what happened with the revolution, with the coup, was what exactly you remembered. I don't know if you're familiar with what's going on in Egypt. So first, it starts by recognizing your own opinion, so saying, okay, I know that I personally stand in this. And one of the things I personally did is that I would identify a colleague who's opposite, and I would ask him to always edit my article to review it. So I would always go to the other colleague, and he would do the same with me. So this is so it starts by self-recognition. There is unconscious bias, I know, but you try to reflect and acknowledge your biases, and then you have to give it to another colleague who disagrees with you, really. Or tell the editor in advance, look, I am aware, this is where I stand on this topic, so I'd appreciate if you take a look at it from someone who's not, you know, doesn't have, for example, a stand, and see if I'm missing anything there.
Yeah. So just 2 quick points. One is that I think all journalists, like human beings, we are biased. So, which is why the process of journalism, the way we report, you know, that is objective. We are not objective people. So I think that training that we get in newsrooms from like good editors is about the process. Like, what is the process you follow to get to the truth? Now, it's not like every time we succeed by telling you the whole truth, but at least the process is something, you know, a good science-inspired process that you can follow. So that's my answer to, you know, how objectivity. Second, someone asked about the media industrial complex. See, I think that's just true in a way. Like a lot of media outlets in India are government controlled, or you see some corporate influence here or there. So I don't know what to do about like the larger media ecosystem. I think at a very individual level, what I can control is the story that I am working on, irrespective of whether I'm like, it's about, you know, fighting the small battles, like with the editor, you know, with like an independent publisher, with myself, about the story that I am telling, that while knowing all the influences, how much can I push to make sure that the story I'm telling is accurate enough? I don't think there is yet found out like a systemic solution to this complex in which we operate, but I think if we recognize it and try to like make sure that the influences don't enter our story, that's the best I can do at my level. So that's how I navigate it personally.
To the issue of maybe to combine the second and the third question. So media capture and the media industrial complex is a huge issue, which is partly why we should also think about the importance of civilian journalism, eyewitnesses, in contexts where you would not expect your government to cover a story, and in fact will not cover it in a way that is reflective of realities. I think eyewitnesses are critical, right? And they're critical because those stories won't be covered in many countries when they're about human rights issues, or they won't be covered because of the failure of international media. And that's why we have to defend their credibility. And we have to think about the ways in which you make it safer and more possible for someone to be an eyewitness, right, at a technical level, and how you think about you defend them against the claims that they are lies, right? And those can be technical solutions. There are ways to think about how you trust literally the credibility of an eyewitness image, and then how do you embed those images in journalistic practice. And I think we've come away from the naive kind of citizen journalism era of 10 years ago, where it was like, just invite everyone to send in our videos and we'll make sense of them. But it's really important to think about the intersection between people who do acts of journalism, when they maybe share a video, and how that fits in institutional journalism. And we still haven't quite got that right, to be honest.
Angelina, very briefly at the end, I want to give the word to you about the eyewitness role, I think.
Yeah, sure. I think my point about eyewitness is, I mean, I already made the point. I think it's vital. But let me get quickly to the point, to the question about bias. I think we're living in the age where conspiracy theories and, you know, making a fact, creating, saying that a fact is a point of view is a huge challenge. I mean, be it Russian propaganda or conspiracy theories about COVID, you know, and other things. What is vital for us journalists is to stress and think, sit down and think how we work with facts, because, you know, Russia says that Ukraine doesn't exist. And, well, the West has this opinion that this is a sovereign country. We have another opinion, and this is a democratic world. Everyone has a right to have their own opinions. Well, you believe that vaccination helps, you know, prevent us from diseases, but I believe, and this is my opinion, that it doesn't. So we need, of course, it's probably a question, it's $1 million question, how we teach people to define, you know, opinions from facts. But this is a very highly manipulative thing. And I mean, I myself, as a Ukrainian, I live in this reality where a neighboring country thinks that, you know, there's an opinion about how the world works. There's an opinion about wars and peace. There's an opinion about, you know, children being deported from Ukraine to Russia, but we save them from war, things like that. We need to, it's a sort of getting back to the roots, getting back to the rules, reminding us, everyone, how the rules and facts look like.
Thank you so much. Unfortunately, we ran out of time, and I just can encourage everybody, at least the speakers who are here and all of you, to continue the conversation until the end of the Kultursymposium Weimar. I want to thank our 4 speakers today. Please give them a round of applause. Thank you also. Thank you also to the team of the Kultursymposium, to our wonderful technical staff here. And yes, enjoy the rest of your day, enjoy the festival. Thank you for coming out.